When you hear the word networking, do you have an almost ick response? We get it. And yet building a supportive network of friends and colleagues is crucial for your success as a cookbook author, and really for anything you do. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. This is Kristin Donnelly, and I'm here today with Kate Leahy and Molly Stevens. Hello.
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 So, what is your immediate response when you're invited to something called a networking event?
Am I supposed to wear a suit?
Cold sweat.
Yeah.
Dry mouth.
I know, totally. I'm like, I'm not going.
I sign up.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess depends, right?
Yeah, it depends. But as it gets closer, a certain amount of nerves around it.
Right. You're like, there's something else I could do on this Tuesday night. Like, I don't know, watch Netflix. And now I forced out to this event where hopefully I see a friendly face kind of thing.
Well, it's also like, what does it even mean? I mean,
for me, being in the world I'm in, the kind of like general networking event is generally not super helpful. Like I know where I am locally, there'll be these like local networking events, but they seem best for people who have like small businesses where they're serving local clients, you know?
Right.
But in our world, if there are networking events, usually we're looking for things geared toward food writers, writers of other sorts, journalists, cookbook authors, obviously. But even those where we might know like half the people, there's still like a little bit of like a feeling, right?
Imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, some of my, I don't say only, but biggest like wardrobe crises have been, getting ready to go to an event that, I think of as a networking event. And I'm going to a conference, or I'm going to something where people I haven't seen in maybe a year or 6 months, and I'm trying to present myself. I don't know. It's so weird. It's like, what's the big deal? It's like, I'm a writer. It doesn't really matter if my jeans are from Gap or.
It's true.
I don't think I'm the only one.
Yeah, no. And yet I do think about how for me, for so much of my career, my network, meaning people I know, people I have relationships with, has been key. And I imagine it's been the same for you.
This podcast wouldn't exist without networking. I mean,
Right.
I met Andrea in 2009 at an IACP conference. It was my very first conference that I went to. I met her. We were introduced by our publisher. And that's how I met you both, was through Andrea.
Yeah, it's funny. She's not here today because she started this group that then turned into this podcast. So
it's true.
Thanks, Andrea.
Yeah.
Right.
She's off networking.
But I remember, Molly, I think I met you in person at another IACP event. And I was nervous, even though I had known you I had never seen you in person. So it was like, oh, I'm going to meet Molly Stevens.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
I know. When I joined a group with Molly Stevens, who wrote my most favorite cookbook ever, I couldn't believe it. If my 24-year-old self could see me now.
Isn't that funny? And meanwhile, I'm sitting here like worried about whatever. But Kate, I remember that meeting because I was standing at a book table for a friend, the Zingerman's books, right? It was a book fair and you walked up. I still remember that. That's right. It's so funny.
That is so funny.
So IACP has been a big part of networking, certainly for me, meaning Andrea, obviously in this career, in this group, but also back from the very beginning of my career, showing up at those conferences was really important. And that, it's so different networking now because there's so many opportunities to network virtually.
First, I want to say, like, are there ways that networking has gotten easier for you, or like even like mindsets you try to get into?
So right now I'm in the process of trying to meet more people who write novels. So maybe this helps to kind of frame it this way for listeners who might be new to cookbook writing or want to get their foot in the door with cookbook writing, because I feel like that's where I am right now with fiction. And no one knows who I am. It's like the opposite of going to ICP these days. It's like going to ICP in 2009. There are certain things that make it hard, but there's also certain things that make it easier. One thing that I think has made it a little bit less daunting is when I can connect with people online first. And then when I'm at an event and and I see them in real life, at least I feel like, oh, I kind of know this person, even if I've only had a Zoom with them or exchanged some like DMs. There's like a little bit of knowledge with the background, but it's still not easy. I went to Thriller Fest for the first time this past June, but I knew a couple of people there just from a workshop that I did with the podcast, The Shit No One Tells You About Writing. And we had been in like a breakout room from their conference, their online conference. And so then we're like, oh, you're going to Thriller Fest. Well, let's meet in person. And I was like, are they going to recognize me? And they were like, hey, Kate. And I'm like, oh my gosh,
that's awesome.
Okay, I know like 2 people here. So that was like, I think kind of friendly. And maybe that's something that I think in food writing and cookbook writing, I think I'm also seeing that. Like our conversation we had with Bibi, she built so much of her network online. Then this fall went on her book tour and is meeting those people in person.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, for me, I think reframing networking helped a lot because to me, networking sometimes implies like needing something from other people maybe or them needing something from you. Like there feels like an inauthenticity to it or the possibility of there being that. And so once I started to just focus on like genuine relationship building and relationships where I don't need anything from anybody. I just want to like be a friendly, helpful person. That's helped a lot.
Yeah.
There is sometimes at networking events that like needy energy. And usually I just try to like steer clear of that if I can.
Right. I mean, there's so many tropes around networking, like
Totally.
the schmooze and you say the inauthentic, the like, oh yeah, trading numbers, never following through this. And, it's like being at a bad cocktail party or, that sort of thing. But the slow game, right? Well, I love the conversation that you had with Carolyn Cho. She talked about networking in sort of being in New York City. And so I think if you're in New York City or you're in the Bay Area or you're in Chicago, you're in a place where there's a lot happening in your field, it's easier to make those connections. But if you're out on your own, and a lot of cookbook writing is out on your own, how do you make those connections? And it has changed so much with online possibilities, email and DMs and everything else we can do now. But I think back to a conversation with Martha Holmberg, and I've known Martha for, I forget how many years we established it, but we met way, way, way back before. And she taught me the value of kind of keeping tabs on people. And even though it's changed in terms of how you can do it, but if there's someone maybe it's an author who you like their work, or it's someone that you were an assistant to their class at some point, just someone who struck you as something I like about what that person is up to just sort of keep tabs on them and maybe drop them a line every now and then, send an email, send a DM, and you never know like where that will lead or if it will lead anywhere, but you're not asking for anything. You're just watching their progression and, you never know really.
Checking in. It's reminding me of when JJ Good was talking about how he often hires, when he's hiring recipe testers, it's like the person he heard from most recently.
That's so true. Yeah.
So I think that is a really good practice. And it's nice. It's like one of the good things about technology is how much easier doing those things are. A text, a DM, like those things, they can be meaningful. And especially with like younger people, like, I don't know, like picking up the phone was so like, that was so normal for so long. And now it's like picking up the phone to call somebody. It's it feels intrusive sometimes. But.
Who would ever leave a voicemail?
Right.
What is
I know.
that? Right.
If there is an opportunity to meet people in person, I think that's even more valuable than ever.
I agree.
And I don't think it has to be, you have to fly to New York City to go to a conference necessarily. I think it can be looking for opportunities in your area. Because I think when you have your local friends who do what you do, it's just then, you can build on that network, and that maybe that one local friend gets a big book deal. And then, when you get your deal, they can write that blurb for you and those kinds of things. But you have a real friendship behind it. So it's not that sort of like gross. Just thinking of like bad networking events. Have you ever been in a conversation with somebody and then they look at your tab and then they're just like, I have to move on and talk to somebody else. Like, has anyone ever had that experience? Because I'm raising my hand right now.
Yes.
Yeah. Or they look past you all the time. And I know it's hard sometimes not to do that because I think for me that's what's overwhelming. It's like there's so much going on around me. And so then to try to like take it all in, and For me, a really successful networking event is when I can get into a great conversation with somebody, whether or not it leads to anything, but just if you can have like a good, like solid conversation with somebody. But what makes for not a good conversation is when somebody's constantly looking past you to see if when somebody more interesting is coming into the room, you know?
Yeah.
Right.
Been there.
But I've also, I think as I've gotten older, I've just learned to like let go of some of that stuff.
Oh, sure.
And not let it bother me. Yeah. Yeah. Whereas when I was younger, I was a little like, how rude. You know?
Right. And also the perspective, I mean, just, I'm still laughing at what he both said at the top about, meeting me. But I remember being at conferences when I was just starting out and seeing, who I thought were the cool kids or the successes, and just being way too intimidated to say anything or to approach and that's tricky. Approaching someone who you don't know that you want to meet is not necessarily the right, I don't know, what am I trying? Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You can't, like, back to it being the slow game. I mean, you could just say, I really admire your work and I just wanted to say hello. And then, I don't know, maybe you send a note later or something. But also I think networking with finding people who are in a similar place.
Oh, sure.
Career-wise.
Peers that you can grow with.
Yep.
Yeah. Is really valuable.
I agree with that.
Because you could share process more than just like, sure, it'd be great to go meet all the superstars, but can they really relate to trying to get your first book right? Or, I mean, of course they can relate to it, but
that's not necessarily what they are there for.
Yeah.
Right. And things change so much that a debut author's experience in 2024, 2025 is different than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So I think that also, as things shift, you kind of need your cohort. So you can have mentors who are beyond where you are right now, just in terms of goalposts that they've passed in their career. But it also really feels good to then have the people who are at the same goalposts so you can compare notes. So you can kind of trade sort of advice that is applicable to the stage. But I think there's also, people who are thought of as mentors can learn a lot from people that they're menteeing too.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I actually learned so much from people. Like when I've taught them or consulted with them, I feel like I learn tremendous amounts. And I was actually just hearing somebody talking about how like she sees almost everybody she interacts with as a mentor in some way or another, in that she learns something from them.
I love that.
Yeah.
Can you give an example? Just curious of like something that you've learned from your class, teaching your classes?
Well, certainly like anybody who's more into content creation, like makes that part of their like daily life and practice. I've learned a lot about that. And then I think just seeing different people's anxieties about writing that maybe I don't share, but then it makes me understand other people's potential anxieties a little bit better. Like I don't know, like if I help somebody through it. And then also just some of the challenges with like the systemic issues within publishing and hearing stories from them, and maybe some of the rejections or some of the misunderstandings that they've had along the way with people. If they share those stories with me, I learn maybe how to make this industry a tiny bit better, hopefully. Mm-hmm. So that's a few examples.
Yeah. I remember when we spoke to Carolyn Chambers about, she was in New York on either book tour or something, and she met up with a number of her, I don't know if she called them colleagues, friends, but people who are sort of doing similar work, books, newsletters. And she learned from them that they work with a buddy. That was her term, a buddy, but not a ghostwriter, but someone who helps them move their book project along. They don't just do it solo. Mm-hmm. And it was a great example of networking, where she reached out because she was in a city that a number of her colleagues were in or visiting, and she, got together and they sort of shared tips on where they are in their development and work. And workflow, I think, is something that I'm always learning from people about.
Totally true.
Yes.
Like managing things. And I mean, it's one of the things I love about this podcast, is talking with so many authors and editors and other people and learning about their process, because everybody's different, but there's so much to learn.
Do you think that if you don't like the word networking, one way to think about it, like as Kristin said, just like reframe it in your mind. But do you also think instead of thinking of it as networking, just think of it as a learning opportunity to learn how other people do the job that you do. Mm-hmm. And then if you think of it that way, then it's not about who you specifically seek out to talk to, who's the big name in the room. It's basically who you are just having good conversations with, and you might come back with like just some new things for your toolkit.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think another thing, I don't know if it's a reframing, but it's just something I try to approach networking, but other things with it is like a spirit of reciprocity. So I don't go into something where it's like, what can they do for me? You know what I mean? And I try to be as helpful as possible. And obviously it's like, if I'm super helpful, then maybe someday I think Caroline Cho used the words like I called in all my favors once she was planning her book tour. But yeah, I do think just like being a helpful person in the world often then makes it more likely that people will be helpful when you need that.
Yeah, it's an abundance mentality.
Totally. It's just like living. It is an abundance mentality. You're absolutely right.
And I find more and more, and I obviously it's part of where I am in my career and my life and stuff. But I as much as I can share, I will share. I mean, it doesn't take away from me to share with someone. I mean, time, energy, that sort of thing. But you never know. I remember years ago, and I don't know if I'm making this up or if it was attributed to Julia Child, but I experienced this in the few times that I was fortunate enough to be around her. She would sit down at a table or dinner or meal or whatever and look for the least interesting, the least well-known maybe person at the table. And you can imagine she was often surrounded with people with some pretty big names. And she would look for the person and say, and tell me, what do you do? And that idea that you never know who's got something going on. And obviously, Julia didn't need to create a network at that point in her career and her life.
Well, she did she was one of the founders of IACP, right?
I believe.
So maybe she did back then find this idea, that she wanted to create a more formal network with her cohort.
I know she was one of the founders of the AIWF, which I believe is no longer around, the American Institute of Wine and Food. And she was involved with the Mandavis in starting that. IACP was a cooking teachers organization at its start. That would be an interesting history to find out.
Well, let me ask you this, just between virtual and in person. I feel like virtual is just so much more accessible for people. It's usually a lower lift. Usually if there's a fee attached to it, it's a lot less expensive. Do any of you have experiences of like how to make a virtual event work for you?
Virtual events I find to be pretty tricky. I know like Cherry Bomb, for example, has a membership. It's inexpensive. I think it's $40 a year. And once a month, they do an event. I don't go very frequently, but the events are usually, it's like a workshop or there's a speaker. But I'm sure if you can always scan who's in the Zoom, and you can often like private message somebody within a Zoom. And if it's somebody you wanted to talk to and just like start a conversation that way, I wouldn't like go on and on with it, but you just say like, hey, cool to see you here. Would you be up to chat sometime? But that brings me to another way where I found it to be like virtual networking to be beneficial, because I live an hour and a half outside New York City now, so I don't get in very often. A few years ago, I was feeling like out of it, out of the scene. And so I popped into a Facebook group where one of the food writer oriented Facebook groups, and just said like, hey, I really miss having random coffees with people the way I used to in New York City. Would anybody be up for coffee like over Zoom? And just put a link to my calendar so people could sign up for slots and I did it for like an entire month. And so I had like 20 different meetings every day for like every weekday for a month. And it was awesome. And I feel like it was a really nice way to like build some good relationships and see what people were up to. And in this industry, it was beyond writers. So it was people who were also doing like various kinds of entrepreneurship in food. So I just learned a lot and recommend if you are like, especially like not in a good strong scene, to try that out. And that's one-on-one. And so that's valuable, I think. Whereas like virtual events can be tricky.
Yeah, I think Facebook groups are I'm glad you mentioned them, Kristin, because there's a lot of them. And from very narrow niche topics, groups to a little more broad. And I love that you did that. Is there a certain vulnerability in doing that? to say, hey, I'm just looking to connect? I mean, are we afraid to, I'm just thinking of myself, if I did that, would I be afraid to admit that I'm like not fully engaged, or I'm, I don't know.
I just framed it as like, I used to do this all the time when I lived in the city.
Yeah, I like it.
And realized it's kind of been missing. And I also like had a very young child. I feel like that just took up so much time. And now my daughter's more school age. So I just had a little more bandwidth. It didn't make me feel strange.
Right.
But like, or like, it didn't make me feel needy. How about that?
Like, I'm lonely. I need friends, right?
It didn't make me feel needy or desperate, because that's like the worst, right? So, and I think because people could sign up, like,
right,
and they could just decide.
You weren't knocking on their doors and saying, like,
nope. I was like, here's my calendar. Sign up for a slot. I'd love to meet you. Actually, I think I have a blog post about it. So we'll share that in the show notes.
I was just thinking about, like, what if you've done food writing, but you've taken a break from it? Maybe you were doing tech writing or you're doing something else and you're trying to get back in. Maybe that's another thing. Because I do feel, for instance, there's this great new bakery that opened close to me, and I went to their preview, but I don't get invites anymore from PR people because I'm not writing about local food restaurants anymore. So I was invited by a friend who's doing that a lot. I realized, like, I recognized some faces, but I had fallen out of that network so far that no one knew what I did or who I was or anything. And it's like, oh, so what do you, like, who do you write for? And I was like, I didn't really have a good, like, canned answer, But it really also made me feel like, it did make me feel vulnerable, like kind of like I'm sort of fish out of water. But it also made me realize that if I really did want to get back into it, like doing more of these things, seeing these people, because the more repetition, oftentimes you come across the same people. And I think that might even occur online, that the same types of people might sign up for the workshop.
Yes.
So you get like repetition with faces and names. And I feel like that's also part of networking.
Totally. Yeah. Classes too.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard that from like Tori Ritchie when she teaches her class, like a lot of the students bond. And then I've taught my class and I know some of the students stay in touch. I don't know. I've heard that from a lot of people, like when they take classes. Kate, I mean, I don't know when you've taken your fiction classes, if you've made some good buddies from that.
Yeah. Oh, I've got this great writing group. Yeah. We meet like every 2 weeks. I just send out a Zoom link and there's 5 of us.
That's awesome.
That's actually, let's talk about size, because I feel like with online networking, if you go to, say, a lecture and there's 100 people at the lecture, and maybe you can like raise your hand, ask a question, but I feel like that's really daunting and scary to just talk in front of 100 people on Zoom, as if you're, a participant and you're there to listen to the expert. But my writing workshop there was the workshop leader and then 5 writers. And so we got to read everybody's work. Every week we would be talking through pages and problem solving for each other. So you get to know people pretty well by reading their work. So by the end of the 12 weeks, you want to keep in touch because you want to see what happens. You want to see if they finish the story. And also you just kind of want to know more about their lives because you focus so much on the writing. You're like, what's going on in Boston these days or DC? So that also is a fun part of it. And I would imagine, Kristin, when we went to Cookbook Fest, there were people who had taken your class.
Yeah, that was fun. I love that.
And they're like, oh my gosh, they were all like thick as thieves together. So
yeah,
that was cool.
That was cool.
Listening to this conversation, so the value of networking, it's a lot of what we're talking about is support system. So you have people in your network who have some experience that relates to yours and can help you through some, whether it's a rough patch or a uninspired patch or just cheer you on or maybe blurb a book or whatever. But there's also, my experience of networking has also been a lot of opportunities.
Yes, for sure.
The strong network that I built early on, especially in my career as a freelancer, that's where I got most of my work.
Yeah.
Is from people that I met and people, and just back to that JG Good, that, you're top of mind or you run into them and they're looking for someone who can do just what you do and they hire you to do it. And then somebody else sees you doing that. And, it can really snowball in the best of ways. So the value, I mean, you never know what can come from the people in your network. But the idea is you're not building the network, hoping to get something out of it, right?
Right.
I mean, maybe like it's there in the back of your mind, but I feel like bringing that, I just keep thinking of it as like a needy energy, like bringing needy energy. People sense it and it's a turn off. So it's more just like bringing like a generous energy if you can.
And it's fine if somebody emails me and says, hey, I'm a photographer. If you're looking for somebody to shoot a cookbook you're working on, keep me in mind. That's fine.
Yeah, for sure.
Most of the time I won't have any work to send their way, but you never know. I'll save the email essentially. Right. If somebody says, hey, do you need help recipe testing? Like probably at that moment I won't, but you never know. And I can save that email. And especially if it's somebody I have met in person at some point, I'll have that name recognition and the email recognition. And that's also ways to sort of just build your network. Or somebody might ask me, hey, have you ever heard of so-and-so? I'm thinking of hiring them for this job. And it's like, oh, they seemed really nice when I met them that one time and we emailed.
Yeah.
Do you have any tricks or tips for after you've met people? Like,
I'm so bad. I'm
really not good with faces and names, and I try. And so I'll often write down, like if I do, if it's a real life event, or I'll take notes. I take notes all the time about it, all sorts of things, but I'll simply write it down. I might write a few things about what they, just to try to help myself to remember.
Yeah. It's hard. Like if you meet two people, I met these people. This was, I think, at a holiday party, and I was introduced to a Michelle and introduced to an Emma. And in my head, I imprinted Michelle's face on Emma. And so I could not think of her as Emma. She was Michelle to me. And I think I saw her 6 months later. I'm like, hi, Michelle. And I got this funny look, and it's like, oh, so we all do that. Yeah, so I need to get better at those mnemonic. It's like Michelle with the maroon sweater.
I worked with someone way, way, way back when I worked on The Joy of Cooking that Maria Guarnaschelli did. And Maria's assistant, Mara Stetz, she's still out and working. And we became, pretty close because we talked on the phone all the time. It was before Zoom and before any video chats. But I never met her. But we talked like every day for weeks, for months. And when I finally met her, I was like, you're not Mara. Like, because she didn't look, her voice I created an image. And obviously this wouldn't happen today because we can look at anybody's picture, but it was so funny. And still, if I see her, I'm like, I have to do a double take because I created this face of a person who I'd never met.
It's funny.
Yeah. When you said assistant, it made me think of something, which is a thing with quote networking, which is like to never treat people who are in a more junior position like they are less than. I'm saying that from personal experience. When I went to an event, I think I was either an intern or an editorial assistant. And I was sent to the event because the editor saw promise in me, right? But the PR person was making a huge stink about it in a way that was like where I knew about it. And it's like I rose up through the ranks and I still feel awful. Like it was just a really bad way to be treated as less than, or you're not worthy of being here. People, when they're junior in their career, they only have one place to go, which is up if they stay in it. So just know that this assistant to your editor might be your editor, not too far in the future.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good point.
Any other wise words we want to share about networking? Or
there's often expense associated with networking. If you're going to join or you're going to travel, that's tricky. And I remember really having, and I still have, there's a conference last month that I really wanted to go to, and timing wasn't great. It was going to cost me too much to fly there. And I just, it's not an easy math to do because you don't really know the cost analysis, how to figure it out. So I guess all I'm trying to say is there's costs associated with it, and you need to just make that decision somehow. Obviously, yes, you can, write it off as a tax, as a business expense. You could write it off as a business expense, but you still have to outlay the money. So it's just something to think about.
Right. And I remember that was one of my hesitations with IACP because those conferences were expensive.
Yeah.
Now they have a one-day summit. It's, I think, a lower lift especially if you live in the tri-state area, but it's still not nothing. Even though I have found value going to IACP, especially when I was in my late 20s, it was just how am I going to afford this? And I think no one should ever put max out their credit card going to conferences.
Right.
So that's the trickiest part of it. It sort of does feel it's a lot. One thing I would recommend is looking to see if there's a local organization that you can join. I know in the Bay Area, I think BB talks about this on the podcast we did with her, but there's a group called Proof Collective, and it's pretty much a free group of people who are food enthusiasts. And there's a Slack and you can communicate on Slack, and people do post like job opportunities or events, and the events are ticketed, but oftentimes these events are potlucks. So organizations like that around people who are interested in food are maybe just as valuable, more valuable than going to a national conference, international conference. Another thing is like with my whole fiction journey, which is I think why this episode couldn't come at a better time, because now I'm having to like, oh, how do I like network again? Like, it's so scary. But in July, I went to this bookstore. That's another thing. Look at your bookstores and see who's speaking at your bookstores and see if there's ways that you can introduce yourself to cookbook authors who are on tour in your area.
Totally.
But like there's this bookstore called Book Passage, which is a large independent bookstore in the Bay Area. And they do this mystery conference in the middle of the summer. I went thinking, oh, it's a local event. I can just drive there. But there were people who flew all over the country who were there at this conference. It was a pretty good turnout. And then being there in person, this one woman named Cara Black, who writes a whole detective series that takes place in Paris. I met her. She had gone to a David Leibowitz signing at Omnivore years ago, so we could connect over food in Paris. And she was sort of like the person putting on the event. So now I feel like, okay, I have my foot in the door in this mystery community in a way that I didn't beforehand. So any opportunities like that, bookstore events, local groups. Kristin, I love your Facebook group idea. See if there's Instagram groups that do the same, these types of events. So then like when you are able to go to a conference and pay the money to go to a conference, you can even get more out of it, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. Yeah. Like if you have those people you've seen in a Facebook group and then you see them in person, it's like there's already a little bit of a relationship. Speaking of a Facebook group, Sally Eckes, Agent Sally Eckes has a Facebook group called How to Be a Cookbook Author. And that is a valuable group to join. A lot of people who ask questions in there and share their wisdom. We can put that one in the show notes. It's funny you were talking about IACP and the money, because like maxing out a credit card, no. If it's a financial stretch, but you think it could be worth it, sometimes it really is. I think about Summer Miller, who is a cookbook author, and she lives in Nebraska. And like, there's just not a lot of opportunity there to connect with other food folks. But because of the folks that she met at IACP, she ended up getting a job at Simply Recipes, and now she works for the Mediterranean Dish. And it's just been really great for her career. And it doesn't necessarily have to be IACP, but she does talk about how that like financial investment was super worth it.
That's a good point. And just don't try to expense your outfits, right? You can expense your travel.
And don't worry about your outfits.
And don't worry about your outfits. No one's going to remember.
No.
That's really funny. Don't expense your outfits. That's so true. I think that was at an IACP. Wasn't there an accounting one where the accountant was like, you can't expense your clothes. Cool. Well, Thanksgiving coming our way.
Yeah, it's a nice time to talk about networking because we're all right before the holiday known for gathering.
Yes.
Talk about being outside of your comfort zone sometimes.
So what you doing this year?
We're going big.
Oh.
We're going big, lot of family.
What does big mean?
I don't know what the final count is it's over 30.
That's big.
Nice.
How many turkeys?
No, well, it's got to be 2.
Yeah.
Is it going to be partially potluck, or are you cooking everything?
Partially potluck. People have assignments. Yes. People will be, certain cousin is very good at this. Somebody else's a niece makes amazing mashed potatoes. There's lots of people have their
thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And you have to do at least one turkey in the house so that the house smells like turkey when people show up. And of course, there are vegetarians in the group and various dietary situations. So there'll be lots of options for all of that.
And so where's the other turkey on the grill?
No, somebody will bring second turkey.
Oh, okay. Got it.
I was thinking if you were into deep frying turkeys, and I was wondering because you never did the all about frying cookbook.
Yeah,
so.
No, my family has had some deep fried turkeys out around Christmas time out in the backyard in the snow.
Wow,
that's fun.
How about you two?
I'm going to my sister-in-law's, and it'll be a small affair, but we have for the past several years all celebrated Thanksgiving together, where it's just like my small family and their small family. My husband's mother, she's a really good cook. We have fun cooking together. So I actually need to connect with her to see what we're doing. Sometimes she is a pescatarian, so she doesn't eat turkey. And then there's not a huge love of turkey necessarily. So last year we actually didn't even do one. I can't remember what we did instead. Because with her being a pescatarian and they're in Maryland, sometimes we do like crabs.
No.
But we'll see.
Yeah, that sounds good. There's one main turkey, and then my mom gets 4 turkey legs separately. There's a recipe from the Preservation Kitchen where we brined the turkey breast separate, and then the legs are braised. And so it's kind of a spin off that. So the nice thing is the legs get braised. The legs get salted, left overnight, Judy Rogers style, and then braised. And then when the day before Thanksgiving, when they're all gelatinous and all that, then pull it apart, take all the bones and skin away. So it just makes this serving of the dark meat, because there's a dark meat contingency in this group, contingency in this group. So we'll do that. My mom sets the table like Tuesday because, you know, it takes too much time to do it last minute and you want to have all the stuff.
How many people?
Somewhere around 20, 25.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's a nice size. You all sit down.
We all sit down, which is the complicated part. So figuring out like who's on the main table, and then do we still have a kids' table, even though we're all middle aged? And then there's like real kids.
Right,
So
right.
We have like these tiers of tables. We do make a recipe that Molly, you made for Gourmet Magazine sometime, maybe in the early 2000s.
Oh, right. The onions.
And it's this, Cipollini onions with pomegranates and balsamic.
That's amazing.
My mom loves it so much that who's peeling those damn Cipollinis is me. But yeah, it's those onions with the pomegranates are so beautiful on a fall Thanksgiving table. There's love for those onions. They're not going anywhere. So.
Yeah. I do love that it's just about the meal. And I feel so fortunate to be a family on both sides that are filled with good cooks. And so it's just
special,
you know, whether it's turkey or crab meat or pumpkin pie or no pie or whatever. It's just a nice holiday because it's really just about the food.
Yeah.
Well, happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Yeah. And happy Thanksgiving to all our listeners. We are very grateful for you.
Yeah. May everyone eat what they want. And, you know, it's okay if you eat a little too much tomorrow.
Totally.
And don't worry about the cleaning up right away. Enjoy it all.
I like that piece of advice.
Thanks for hosting, Kristin.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. The show is available wherever you get your audio, and if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. It really helps. Any books mentioned in the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thanks, as always, to our editor, Abby Sarcatella. Until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.